Hi, here's an update. I had previously talked about what looked like perhaps the first example of a deaf interpreter in a court scenario in Cork in 1863. But first, I just wanted to clarify and to clear up something about that. In my previous vlog, I'd maybe given the impression that this was the first ever deaf interpreter. Now, what I meant was the first deaf interpreter in a court setting, that type of courtroom situation. I wasn't talking about deaf interpreters in other settings, so settings of worship, religious services for deaf people, or special masses for deaf people. Those kinds of scenarios have plenty of historical evidence of deaf interpreters for weddings, for prayer services, and other forms of worship and so on, well before 1863. So I haven't found anything of this antiquity. But what I have found is what perhaps could be the first deaf interpreter in a courtroom setting. Okay? Now, I'm sure that's not necessarily the first ever deaf interpreter in a courtroom setting in the world. But I don't necessarily like to overuse the phrase first, like the first deaf interpreter. It's just that when you find evidence in the course of historical research, there's always the possibility that later on you'll find more evidence of a previous case. So there's a danger in saying this is definitely the first case of this, the first example. It all depends on evidence, and if you keep looking for evidence, keep doing your historical research, you can find evidence before the so-called first example of anything. But leaving that aside, again, back to the interesting topic of deaf interpreters. And I had found this 1863 case in Cork of what looked like a deaf interpreter. But the issue with that was the newspaper article that I was basing that on just mentioned three words: through another mute. Another newspaper that came out the same day about the same situation didn't mention anything at all. So we don't know anything about this deaf person's name. And we don't have any court documents produced around the same time, any official court documents that would back up this evidence or give us more information, because the Cork City Police Courts in 1863, they haven't left us records that we can check to corroborate. So we're entirely dependent on these three words: through another mute. That's all we have. So anyway, today I'm continuing to do my historical research, and I find another example that's quite similar. But it was from 1867, 4 years after this Cork City case. And the example that I found in 1867 is a County Limerick example. The area that the court was based in is Foynes. And you can see the example here. So in this example, a deaf boy, whose name is John Morgan, decides himself to sue a hearing man named Patrick Mullins. Morgan sues Mullins because previously Mullins had hired Morgan for a short time to do some work. Money was owed to Morgan that Mullins hadn't given, this £2 debt that was owed to Morgan. So Morgan decided to bring him to court. But when he went into the courtroom in Foynes, John Morgan brings another individual with him who's also deaf. This second deaf person's name is Cornelius McMahon. Cornelius McMahon is mentioned in the newspaper. His name is given. The fact that he's deaf is also given. And you can see the quote in the newspaper coverage, in the sentence was that McMahon was brought, this other silent individual in the phraseology of the newspaper, Cornelius McMahon was brought in, and he was trusted by Morgan to act as an interpreter in the courtroom setting. So the newspaper article says that both John and Cornelius were strenuously trying to explain the case to the magistrates. The magistrates were kind of like a judge, but there was a bench of magistrates. At the time, these lower courts wouldn't have had a single judge. They might have had one or two or three magistrates sitting, deciding on these cases. So the magistrates in this case decided, look, we're going to dismiss this case. So that was the outcome of the case. this newspaper article specifically mentions this second deaf person, the deaf person's name, the fact that they were acting as an interpreter. Now, there's an issue with this still, in that we don't have a second example of a newspaper to back this story up. I've had a little bit of a look and I can't find anything yet. Again, the official court documents don't seem to be in existence for Foynes, the Petty Sessions Court in Foynes at the time. So I don't have those as a resource either. So again, we just have this one single piece of evidence that this happened. But this piece of evidence is far clearer compared to the 1863 example in Cork, which just had 3 words that we were depending on. Not very much. But here in this Foynes 1867 case, we do have more information and more detail. And just to give you some additional information also, so Cornelius McMahon did attend St. Joseph's in Cabra. But what's interesting about this, well, there's 2 interesting points to make. The first is, Cornelius McMahon acted as an interpreter in this case, so you would expect him to maybe have good literacy, good capability in English, maybe slightly, has an ability to speak. We're not quite sure. But the St. Joseph's School report that gives details about when pupils were admitted and when they left, and I have found Cornelius on this, it said that Cornelius McMahon left school early. He didn't stay for the full 6-year term. I don't know exactly how many years he did stay. I haven't found that in my research yet, but we know that he left early. He didn't finish his education. So that's interesting in itself. And the second piece of information that's interesting is the court case itself happened in 1867. But Cornelius began attending St. Joseph's in Cabra later on in 1869. So what does this mean? It means 2 years before he entered a deaf school, he was acting as a deaf interpreter. It's very hard to square these pieces of information with each other. It's very hard to know exactly what's going on. So what's the answer? What really did happen? Well, who knows? It's very hard to say. But we know that Cornelius McMahon himself, well, it is possible that he in fact was the one that went to court. And John Morgan may have been an older, more skilled in English friend of his who was also deaf. So that's a possibility, because Cornelius hadn't entered school yet. There's also the possibility that Cornelius, even before school, had been educated by maybe his parents bringing in a private tutor, his parents' own encouragement that he would learn before going to school, to such an extent that he was able to help this other deaf person in court. And then it was only after this period that he would have entered St. Joseph's. I'm not quite sure. There's a range of different answers, a range of different things that might have happened, and all we have is this one piece of evidence. So that's your update. Thanks.